I'll now hand over the mic to Anthony Salopek, who is going to be the presenter for today. And he is a Microsoft Certified Expert Business Analyst from Cadence Solutions. The floor is yours, Anthony.
All right, thank you so much, Sang. I hope everyone can hear me. Hi, my name is Anthony Salopek. So as Sang introduced me, I am a M365 business analyst who works at Cadence Solutions. I am a certified expert within SharePoint and Purview. I also have familiarity working within Power Apps, and I will be the one guiding today's session. So I'm just going to take control here and begin to share my screen.
Sounds good. And I'll be on the chat answering questions as they come in.
All right. Perfect. So with that, we're just going to jump straight into today's seminar. We have only 1 hour, so we're going to try and keep a rhythm with us. What we're going to do is we're first going to go through some enablement with the PowerPoint slides, and then we're going to transition into a demo. So governance within Purview. Purview has these 4 pillars about knowing your data, protecting your data, preventing data loss, and then governing it. And these are kind of the 4 pillars that Purview is built upon for protection and governance of data within your organization. So the first one is knowing your data, identifying the sensitive data across your organization. Where is it being stored? Is it being shared? All that kind of stuff. The next component is protecting it. You have to now classify this information and apply sensitivity labels, retention labels, things like that, so that your sensitive records and data are kept in place and users are notified as such. Then preventing data loss. So here you can create certain policies and apply encryption to restrict access to certain documents, files, things like that. And then finally is governing your data, which is enforcing those retention and deletion policies, managing records, and monitoring the classification and policy-related activities. So this is what we're focusing on today, is governing the data within a SharePoint online environment. So with governing your data, you're going to be enforcing those retention and deletion policies. This is just a quick overview of the Purview components. So within Purview, we have records management, data classification, information protection, e-discovery, data loss prevention, and then audit and content searching capabilities. So Purview is a very rich app within the Microsoft environment. There's a lot of different things you can do with it, and we're going to be focusing in on records management today. So we're going to look at creating a retention label and then applying that retention label to content within a SharePoint Online site. So before we go any deeper, we're just going to quickly talk about licensing requirements, because this is kind of your gateway into Purview. So if you think of you're going to the airport, in order to catch a flight, you're going to need a ticket. Well, the same way it is with Purview, you're going to need the correct licensing in order to access Purview and kind of get that rich user experience. So firstly, licensing requirements. Automated records management requires an E5 license. So we gave a little example here. Depending on your organization, the configuration, there's a chance that there are different licensing being applied to different users, but a lot of organizations use E3, so that's the example. But an E3 user just going about their day adds a document to a document library where a retention label is automatically applied utilizing metadata. Since that user is benefiting from an E5 related service, this is in violation of the licensing agreement. And so this is something that we just want to be very clear about, that even if the user themselves is not performing an E5 action, if they benefit from an E5 licensing action or configuration, that user themselves also needs an E5 license. So licensing differences. Here we just highlight the differences between an Office 365 license and then an M365 license. So the Office licenses include the Office suite and services such as Exchange, OneDrive, SharePoint, and Teams. An M365 license includes the O365 and then layers and then gives additional layers for security, machine learning, device management, and system management. So the best way to describe it is your M365 license are just like a more extensive version of an Office 365 license, just layering different capabilities and features. And then recommendations and references. Here are some links that users are able to click for references in regards to licensing. And then also, sorry, we also have this handy little diagram that just kind of shows the different kind of actions you can take given the different licensing a user has been given. And as you can see, under the M365 category of licensing, the E5 is like the most powerful license a user can be assigned. It allows all these different activities within Purview, so such as applying non-record retention labels manually and all that good stuff. So if there's any questions, just send them in chat and we'll just keep going. So Purview components, records management. So the first thing we're going to define today as part of Purview and understanding records management within Purview is retention labels. So generally, most organizations have a retention schedule, classifications, things like that, that say, apply this kind of retention to this type of document. So within Purview, that is a retention label. So retention labels are applied to items in allocation. So they can be applied to a specific file, they can be applied to a folder, they can be applied to a library, and they just designate that everything in that location or any file tagged with this label is going to have certain actions and retention applied to it. End users can see retention labels and set them themselves unless you enable auto labeling. A label can trigger a disposition review at the end of its retention period, which is something a lot of users like. And we're going to go in depth in all of these topics. You can declare content as a record or regulatory record, and then retention can start on a variety of triggers such as creation date, modified date, or the date it was labeled, or a specific event within your organization. So now we're just going to go in a little bit deeper and discuss the actions that retention labels can take. So our first one is retain only. So this is when the retention label is configured in a way that says when this label is applied, retain all items for a minimum of 3 years or retain forever. So that's the first type. The next type is retain then delete. So this is saying now that any item or file labeled with this retention label, please return it. Sorry, please retain it for like 2 years. So it's going to be retained within the system for 2 years. And then after 2 years, it'll just be automatically deleted. So that's the second type. Our third type is delete only. So this is just saying that after a certain amount of time, just automatically delete the content. And the example given is delete all Teams chats after 30 days they've been sent. And they can also be deleted earlier by users. Just labeling will classify a document or a file, but it doesn't enforce any retention period or deletion. It's just labeling. So sometimes in an organization, they just want to label their content. And then after it's been labeled, they can then replace that label with maybe one that includes a retention duration or deletion. And then our last type of retention label, and one of the most powerful ones, is retaining and then taking action. So the first action we kind of reviewed was that you can retain an item for a certain amount of time and then have it automatically deleted. But Purview doesn't just stop there. There's actually a richer experience where you can retain an item for a certain amount of time and then take actions. So some of the actions you can perform after the item has been retained in the system for its given duration include launching a disposition review, launching a Power Automate flow, applying a different label, or even extending the retention period. So there's a lot of different actions you can do after its first kind of duration has expired. Just to touch on that a little deeper. So once the retention duration of a file is completed, so let's say we have a retention label that says, keep this item for 2 years and then launch a Power Automate flow. This is kind of a new feature being pushed out by Microsoft that's currently within preview. And what this is saying is that when this item is at the end of its retention period, trigger a Power Automate flow. So Power Automate lives within Power Apps, and it's kind of like that business process automation. And by launching a Power Automate flow, you can do things such as running a custom disposition approval process, notifying document owners, move the item to a centralized archive, generate a custom certificate of destruction. This is a really rich feature that's getting pushed out by Microsoft, and we at Cadence are really excited to see how this is going to play out and kind of give users more flexibility with their retentions and what happens after a certain retention period with files. So I already kind of mentioned some of these terms, but we're going to go a little bit deeper into the types of retention labels. So previously, we reviewed these different kind of actions or paths a retention label can take. Now we're actually going to look at the configuration of the label itself and how it impacts the content that's getting marked with these labels. So the regular label will retain items even if a user deletes it. And then you can go up a step further, and then we have, and then we have these record labels. And within SharePoint Online, when a record label is applied to a file, you're actually going to see a little record symbol appear beside the file's name. So one thing that we do like to point out is that both regular labels and record labels will prevent the content from being deleted. The only difference is that with a regular label, users can visually see it getting deleted, but what's happening in the back end is that it's actually getting saved into a preservation hold library. So you can rest assured that its retention will be satisfied. So for example, if I'm working in SharePoint and I upload a file and it has a regular label applied saying, please keep for 2 years, then delete. If I just happen to delete that file before the end of that retention period, I'll see it removed, but on the back end, it's still going to be kept for that 2-year retention in a preservation hold library. Whereas with a record label, you're actually not going to be able to delete it at all. So users will get a little pop-up saying like, sorry, you can't delete it. And you see that little record symbol. And then finally, we have regulatory record labels, which you could think of these as like the final boss of retention, where basically once a file has been labeled as a regulatory record, it cannot be deleted by anyone, even admin. So that is a very powerful one. And if you go into this next slide here, you can actually see that content labeled as a regulatory record is immutable. You'll get this little warning message when you enable that, or if you want to configure that as part of your retention label settings. And so that's really for those really core vital documents where nobody should be deleting them. So onto our next slide. This is now just comparing a little deeper the differences between regular labels, record labels, and regulatory record labels. So what I want to kind of demonstrate on this slide is that as I was talking about record labels, there's actually 2 types. We have unlocked and locked. And really the core difference between a record label that's unlocked and locked is that when a record label is in the unlocked state, users can still edit the file's contents. And then finally, once it's in the locked state, which a user can just do by flipping a little switch within the document's properties, it's now in that immutable state and it can no longer be edited. So that's kind of that key difference. So sometimes in an organization, let's say you're working on a contract and you know that it needs to be locked down, no editing, can't be deleted, can't be moved, things like that. So it can start its life as a record label that's unlocked. And then once users have completed the contract, they can just switch it to the locked status. And that just kind of enforces a little bit more records management actions there in security. So now that we've discussed retention labels in depth, we're going to discuss how they're now published to SharePoint sites, Outlook, all these different locations within M365 so that they can actually be used. So up until now, we're just talking about retention labels, the different actions they can take, the different kind of settings that can be put upon them. And now we're actually going to talk about how they're going to be published and used by users. So a label policy is a published or auto-applied policy to a specific location within SharePoint. So with publishing, you just choose the retention labels you want to publish to a specific site, and then they're going to be visible to end users to apply them manually. And then with auto-labeling retention labels, you choose a retention label, select, oh, I would like to apply this one automatically, put in some parameters, and then those labels will be automatically applied to certain files based on your parameters. So to go a little bit more in depth, we have 3 ways of applying retention labels to files within M365. We have manual classification, defaulted classification, and auto classification. So the very first one is manual classification, and this is something that Cadence doesn't typically promote because there are better ways that you can do retention within your organization. However, the very first one is kind of the simplest approach, is that users manually classify their files with the retention labels published by your organization. So even though it's very simple, it leads to a lot of user error, lower classification rates because users tend not to know which kind of labels to apply. There's kind of like training that goes in with that. So we don't typically recommend that one. What we do recommend is defaulted classification or auto classification. So defaulted is really that like set it up and don't have to think about it classification of files. where you can set that an entire SharePoint document library or specific folders have a retention label defaulted to them. So whenever a user drags and drops a file, creates a file in that location, automatically their file is going to be tagged with the correct retention label, and then the correct actions will be performed on the file. So it can be retained for its set period, it can be automatically deleted or go into disposition review. Whatever settings you put into that label, rest assured that as long as you default a retention label to a location, all content in that location will inherit it. And then finally, auto classification is a bit more flexible to a changing information architecture, and it's best for event-based retention. So a great example I could give is, once again, you're working on a contract and the contract has been closed, completed. So instead of putting that contract in a library with a defaulted classification, you can leverage the metadata of the status of the contract to say, like, hey, when this contract is of status closed, you can have an auto apply policy that will automatically apply a retention label based on that status being closed, so a metadata status of closed. So this one is a little bit more harder to deploy. However, it does really have a rich use case scenario, and there are situations where it's highly beneficial. So just to go a little bit deeper, defaulted classification. This slide just shows that you can apply a label to the items within a document library. And then you also have this checkbox option to say that you want to apply the label to existing items in the document library as well. And something we just wanted to call out with defaulted retention is that if a retention label is already applied on a document, an auto apply process will never override or replace that label, even if an auto apply condition is met. All right, so to kind of go a little bit deeper, this diagram just shows an example of that. So if you could picture your organization, you have a hub site. I'll just give an example of a corporation everyone knows. Let's just say like Shaw. We have our Shaw hub site. Underneath Shaw, they have a procurement site. And within their procurement site, they have these different document libraries. And then you can default different retention labels to different document libraries. So their vendors document library is getting contracts. Their policies and procedures library is getting a policies and procedures retention label. And it's just very seamless, which is what we like to promote, is seamless record management, wherein users just go about their daily life, uploading files, creating files, and automatically they're getting appropriately tagged and labeled with the correct retention label based on the container they live in. And these retention labels populate downward. So for example, if you create a folder within vendors, you can have a very deep folder structure, but the retention label will still populate downward to all the files. So that's something to point out as well, that you set it at the library level, and any files living within this MSA subfolder will automatically inherit it. All right, so a little bit more on auto classification. So as I mentioned, auto classification is typically based on certain conditions, typically metadata. So with metadata, you can have choice columns, managed metadata columns, date columns, number columns. Any kind of metadata you utilize within your organization can be leveraged for auto applying a retention label. So the example we gave here is just kind of a query where you want to apply a retention label when the expiry date of the file is less than current date and the file type equals statement of work. So now we kind of have these two components put together, saying that if you have a document library, any file that equals a statement of work type and then has an expiry date less than current date should get applied a specific label. So you can see right away how this can get quite actually specific based on your use cases, that based on certain metadata columns, certain content types, you're able to specify what retention labels should be applied. So it's a little less quick, kind of like one and done as like defaulting a retention label, but this is really good if you leverage lots of metadata in your organization, if you leverage a flat architecture, definitely lots of use cases for this. Finally, before we proceed into our demo, we just wanted to discuss scopes. So the scope kind of specifies where the labels are going to be published. So when you're just publishing labels to a site so they could be manually applied or manually applied to a folder so that can default downwards, You can choose a static scope or an adaptive scope. So a static scope is pretty straightforward. You would just copy the URL of your SharePoint site and say, please publish this retention label or this list of retention labels to this site. So this is typically what we recommend in 80% of situations if your organization has a more fixed architecture. However, the onus is on the user to keep the locations up to date. Alternatively, we do have adaptive scopes, which automatically updates the location of where retention labels are being published based on the inclusions and exclusions based in queries you create. So this is a bit more flexible and allows complex retention requirements and doesn't have the same limits as a static scope. So those are just some things to keep in mind. The kind of example I like to give is if you're an organization that's very project-based, constantly making new SharePoint sites for projects, you could include some sort of conditions within your site, naming conventions or something along those lines to say every time you have a project, put dash project in the SharePoint site title, and then you can have an adaptive scope saying that every time a new SharePoint site is created containing this prefix project, please publish these retention labels. So that's kind of one way to think about it. But for most organizations, static scope should serve them well. And if they do find the need that a new site is created, they can just add that site to the list of sites that are getting those retention labels published. So for 30 minutes in, I hope everyone is keeping along. I know I am keeping the pace of things pretty fast, but what I really want to focus on today is demoing, creating a retention label and a retention label policy, showing a disposition review. So just kind of as an outline of today's demo, we're going to see the Purview Compliance Center. So we're going to see what that looks like. We're going to create a retention label. We're going to publish a retention label. We're going to see it getting applied to a document and it getting made a record. And then finally, we're going to perform a disposition review. So I've already pre-configured a SharePoint site. As with retention, there is some delays and lags with things, and I'll kind of explain that as I continue my demo now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing the presentation, and I'm now going to share my tab, and here we are. We are now within Microsoft Purview, formerly known as the Compliance Center. We have this left-hand navigation menu, and from here, we are able to navigate downwards to see the Records Management Center. So that's right here. So if you've never seen this before, there's a lot of different things you can do within within Purview, but today we're just going to be focusing on records management, and I already have that open in this tab here. So here I am within the records management portion of Purview, and here we can see we have an overview, file plan, label policies, scopes, policy lookup, events, and disposition. So what we're going to be focusing on is file plan and label policies and disposition for today's session. So on the very front page, you can actually see which retention labels have files that require disposition. So we have some files pending disposition. We can see label applications recently. So we see some files were labeled recently, manually applied, automatically applied. Your overview page just kind of gives you an overview of what's going on in your organization, you know, what's getting labeled, what's ready for disposal, things like that. What I'm now going to do is I'm going to click on the File Plan tab, and we're going to create a retention label together. So I've already created a label within SharePoint called Day 1. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to recreate that label today together to show what that looked like. And I'm just going to call it, one day, that's what it was called, 1 day demo. So once you select create a retention label, the first prompt you're going to be given is renaming your label. You're not going to be able to rename it later on, so please do select a name that fits for your organization. Naming conventions vary across organizations, but common ones that we see are naming conventions based on the configuration of the label. So maybe the label gives you an indication of how long the item's retained, if it's deleted, what was the trigger. It's really at your organization's discretion. Some organizations just put numbers because they have a retention schedule that has the different numbers and what they mean. Next, you can provide a description for users. So you can describe what this label's for, what kind of document types apply to it, things like that. And you can also provide a description for admin. These can be changed later on, but please note that you cannot rename your label after it's been created. So I'm going to hit the next button. And now we can define some more descriptive metadata for our retention label. So maybe you're an organization who has a list of retention labels like contracts +5. And there's a reference ID that corresponds to that, 001. So here you can actually give your retention label reference ID. That's another way of kind of tracking them. You can choose the business function and department. So I'm just going to choose one. Let's just say it's administration. You can also add your own custom business functions and departments. You can choose a category. Once again, I'll just choose the first one here, accounts payable. You can also choose a subcategory. You can choose an authority type. So it could be a business, legal, regulatory record. And then finally, you can provide a citation. So we already have some pre-cooked here, but oftentimes a retention schedule is a combination of an organization's own kind of retentions and what they need, and then legal laws saying like certain types of documents must be kept for 5 years, etc. So you can also add citations to your labels as well. And all of this can be changed after you've created a label. So if your citations change, if the business function changes, you can easily go in and edit your label after. So now we're going to begin defining label settings. So circling back to what I talked about in our PowerPoint, we can apply settings to choose what happens to items when they are labeled with our retention label. So we have 3 options. We can choose to retain the item forever or a specific period of time. We can enforce actions after a specific period of time, or you can just label the items. So what we're going to do is we're going to select the first option, retain items forever or a specific period of time. And this is going to allow us to configure our retention period. So for this retention label, we're just going to do custom. I believe the configuration was just keeping it for 1 day. So that's what I'm going to do. And then we can choose when the retention period starts. So we can choose based on when it was created, last modified, when the item was tagged. You also have these different event types within Purview. However, the functionality of an event type and then when the items were labeled is very similar. So typically what we recommend is that if a certain action happens where suddenly a file needs a label applied, we would choose the option when items were labeled, as that's very similar to an event type triggering the need for a label to be applied. So I'm just going to select when items were labeled for this example. Next, we're going to choose what happens during the retention period. This is where we're able to mark the item as a record, regulatory record, or just as a regular record. So the very first option is just regular record. The second option is mark items as a record. So we're going to see that little lock symbol. And then the final option is a regulatory record. So for today's example, we're just going to go with a regular record. And so users will still be able to edit the item, change it. And if they do delete it, we're going copies will be sent to that secure location. So as I mentioned earlier, that preservation hold library is where all those deleted files that have been applied a regular retention label are going to live, and they're going to live out their retention. So we're just going to go with the first option. And then finally, at the end, we're going to select start a disposition review. So we've configured our retention label just for 1 day. For testing purposes, we just want to say label it 1 day after 24 hours. Since it's been labeled, it's going to be eligible for a certain action. So what we want to trigger is a disposition review. Other options are delete items automatically, change the retention label, trigger a Power Automate flow, or deactivate the retention settings. So for most organizations, they would typically choose between delete automatically, start a disposition review, or run a Power Automate flow. We're going to select a disposition review. And this means that this file is now eligible for destruction, but we need some eyes on that document before it's removed from the system and permanently disposed of. So we're going to create stages. We're going to add a stage here, and we're just going to call it Stage 1 Manager. And now we can type the email of a user. So I believe we have one in our system called Eddie. Eddie is the manager of our department. He's going to be the first person to review this document. Now we're just going to add a second stage. We're going to call it Stage 2 RM Team. And you can assign users or mail-enabled security groups here. So if you were to assign a mail-enabled security group, the first person in that group to review the file will just push it on to the next stage. So that's another feature a lot of users like, is that they don't just have to specify one user, they can actually have a collection of users who are able to review the file and then push it to the next stage. So for this one, I'm just going to put a single user again, but I'm going to do Adam. That's the current account I'm logged in. So the logic here is that Eddie is the manager of our department. He's going to review the file first. If he approves it for disposal, it's going to get pushed on to me. I'm a member of the records management team, going to make sure everything's okay to be deleted. I will approve disposal, and then that document will be destroyed and removed from the system. So I'm going to hit OK, and I'm going to hit Next. And now I'm able to review the retention label I've just created. So I can see the name of the label, reference ID, business function categories, provisions, retention settings. I can see that at the end of the retention period, I want to trigger a disposition review. So I'm going to hit create the label. Give that a second to load. And now that I've created my label, I'm now going to publish it. So after you create a retention label, you can choose to do nothing, but what we're going to do today is we're going to now publish our retention label called one day demo into a specific SharePoint site. And you also have the option to auto-apply this label or do nothing and publish it later on. So what I'm going to do is just right away, I'm going to publish my retention label. And something I just want to speak to now about why we kind of pre-cooked everything prior to the demo is that when you do publish a retention label to specific locations, it can take up to 7 days to appear within that location. So that's why the same way cooking shows, they cook a turkey before and suddenly they're like, oh, it was magically cooked within 10 minutes. That's kind of what we're doing here. We're going to show what it looks like to publish a retention label, and then we're going to actually see them in action on a site where they've already been published to. And the same goes for auto-applying. Once a document satisfies and auto-applies conditions, it takes up to 7 days for the content to be automatically labeled. So I'm just going to hit next, and I'm going to publish my label. So here I can choose what label I want to publish. You're able to publish multiple labels at a time, but right now we're just going to publish one label. So that is our 1 day demo. And this says to keep the item for 1 day, review it. After it's approved by the disposition reviewers, it will be deleted from the system. And we're going to hit next. Now we're going to choose our scope. For today's demo, I'm just going to do a static scope. I'm going to hit next. And then I'm going to choose specific locations. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off these other locations that I'm allowed to publish labels to. So we have Exchange mailboxes, SharePoint, OneDrive, and M365 group mailboxes. I'm going to turn off these other ones. I'm just going to, I'm just going to keep SharePoint on. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to edit this and just specify the site that I want to publish it to. So within this other tab here, we have this Cascadia Information Governance demo site. This is just our site that we utilize to show different Purview actions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this. I'm going to paste it here. I'm going to hit enter. Here we see the site URL. Just double check you copy and pasted the URL. Sometimes if you have an extra slash or a space, SharePoint's not going to like that, or sorry, Purview's not going to like that, and you might run into some issues there, but we're just going to hit done. So now we see I'm going to publish my retention label to just one specific location, which is that SharePoint site I just put here. And we're going to hit next. Now we're going to give our retention policy a name. This name is just going to be seen within Purview. So a great example of a policy is maybe you need 20 different retention labels for your accounting site. I would just call this policy your accounting, retention label policy or something like that. So it's very user intuitive. They can see all the retention labels that are being applied to that site or that location, something like that. If you're applying a retention label org-wide to all your different kind of like sites and Exchange mailboxes, things like that, maybe you would give it a more general name like global policy or something like that. I'm just going to call this ARMA Demo Policy 2023. You can give a description of the policy. So here you would say like, this policy is getting published to this site. These labels are included in it, etc. Your description can be changed later on. Unfortunately, after you name a policy, it is fixed, so you cannot rename it later on. We're going to hit next, and we get to review. So we see what labels we're publishing, we see what locations, we see the name and the description. So first, I just want to make note again is that most labels will be available to users within 1 week. So that's just kind of the time frame. It can go quicker, give or take. If you don't see your labels being published within 1 week, there's a chance there was an error publishing them, or there could be something on the back end. So that might be a Microsoft thing that you have to go and contact them to find out. But in most cases, your labels will be published within a week. I'm going to hit submit. Oh, cannot access disposed object. I hit OK. Let's go back one. Static. Just hit next. Submit. Compliance. Oh, it already exists. That's why. Okay, I'm going to, sorry, the name I gave already is there. I'm just going to call this Anthony Policy, and I can delete this later, 2023. Submit. Perfect, it was published. So as you can see right there, every name has to be unique as well. I guess I already had a retention policy with the same name, and it was giving me a little error there. So now what we're going to do is we're going to navigate to a site to show the kind of end user experience and those different ways we're going to apply retention labels. So I'll hit done here. I'm going to see that retention label published to my site about within a week. However, we already have this one here called 1 day. And this was already published to the site. It's already getting applied to files, and we're going to see that in action right now. So back on my Cascadia Information Governance demo site, we have 3 document libraries that kind of show the 3 different ways you can apply a retention label. So the first one we're going to demonstrate is manual retention or folder retention, where it's defaulted to a folder. So I'm going to click on my folder retention document library. Just going to zoom in a bit too. So here within this document library, we see that we have these 2 folders, contracts and tax forms. The contracts folder has the contract retention label defaulted to it, and then the tax form folder has the tax forms retention label defaulted to it. If I click inside this folder, we see this file automatically inherits that retention. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag and drop a file now. Oh. 1 second. Just going to pull one up from my desktop, documents. Okay. There we go. So what I've done is I just dragged and dropped a test PDF from my desktop, and we see automatically it inherits the retention label defaulted to the folder. If I go into the tax forms folder, I'm going to now copy in another document, or sorry, drag and drop. And here again, we see the tax forms retention label set on the folder is automatically getting defaulted to the file. However, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag and drop a file into just the general document library. And we're going to see that no retention label is getting applied to it because within this document library, we're only defaulting retention labels on the folders, and then everything else that lives here has to have manually a retention label applied to it. So as you can see with the Cadence credit card, we manually applied the earnings report retention label. And what I'm going to do now is for my Clifford Spencer PDF, I'm going to select it. I'm going to open up the details pane, which is just right here in the upper right corner. We see this little information symbol. I'm going to click that. Here I get to see all the metadata properties associated with this file, and I can manually apply a retention label. So here I can select the 1-day retention label. And here we see it's been automatically tagged with the 1-day retention label. And then just to show a record label, let's see here. I've now selected the Seattle project one. And let's see if we have a retention label that shows the lock symbol. So let's see. Let's try this one. No. I'd probably have to double check which one has a lock symbol on it. But if you have a retention label that's declares the file as a record, you're going to automatically see a little lock symbol beside those files. And if you're noticing those little triangles beside those files, we're actually going to talk about that at the end, just once we wrap up on retention, but that is actually related to a data loss prevention policy when SharePoint identifies your file contains sensitive information. So the next one I just want to demonstrate is library retention. So this is retention defaulted on the document library as shown within the PowerPoint slides. So if you look in the contracts folder, we see 1 day. This entire library has had the 1-day retention label defaulted to it. So anything inside a folder is going to get this. Anything living flat in the document library is going to get this. I'm just going to drag in another document. We see automatically it's getting that 1-day document, that 1-day retention label applied to it because it's been defaulted to the document library. And if I pull it into this folder as well, pull that in. Oh, there we go. Just cancel that. There we go. Once again, I dragged in this UAT Elena Parks PDF and automatically the retention label is getting applied. Even if I create another subfolder, so we'll just call this subfolder 2, go inside it. Once again, I'm going to drag in this Elena Parks PDF. And we see the retention label just keeps pushing downward. It's been defaulted at the document library level. So every file within this document library, even if it's within a subfolder, is going to inherit that retention label. Finally, we're going to show auto retention. So this has already been done so that these files were created prior to this session. We created a document set, and a document set is just like a folder with metadata. And the metadata we set up here, which is our document status and company, will populate downward to all the files within the document set. So if I click on this blue project, here we see all the files inherit that inactive metadata status. And because they were declared as inactive, they're getting the 1-day retention label automatically applied to them. So if I were to drag in another PDF right now, I have this Harry one. So I'm dragging it in. Here we see the Harry Peterson PDF has been dragged and dropped inside my blue project document set. It's inheriting all the metadata. And now within 7 days, SharePoint is going to Purview is going to automatically apply the 1-day retention label to this file because it has a document status of inactive. So unfortunately, we can't show that within real time. It does take some backend time, but that is something that's getting pushed out by Microsoft, that it's looking for any files that live within this document library and have a status of inactive is going to get the 1-day retention applied. If I go into the Seattle project document set, we see both these files have a status of active and they have been given the retention label of a project. So once again, within the same document library, you can actually have multiple auto-apply based policies based on different conditions. And these different conditions can designate different labels getting applied to different types of files that live within the same location. So in situations where you have like maybe contracts and invoices living in the same location, but they require different retention periods or different actions after their retention, you can leverage auto-apply policies to correctly label them based on a metadata status or a content type. Therefore, they get the correct label while living in the same location. Whereas with defaulting, you kind of want to ensure that all the files that live within that defaulted library or defaulted folder, that everything in that container can inherit the same retention label. So now, kind of briefly in our last 10 minutes, I'm going to show some extensions of records management and Purview, and we're going to briefly touch upon sensitivity labels and data loss policies. data loss prevention policies. So if you've probably been noticing, some documents here have this little triangle symbol. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click that, open up the details pane, and here we see that we're getting this little policy tip from SharePoint saying this item contains sensitive information. All recipients must be authorized to receive this content. So this is a data loss prevention. This is when a data loss prevention policy has been triggered. So on the back end, we created a data loss prevention policy that states whenever a file has been shared within the organization and contains sensitive information, so the sensitive info types we chose were like bank accounts, passport number, things like that, you're going to automatically get this warning. So data loss prevention policies show this tooltip to users, and they also can have a whole host of things on the background, such as encrypting content, notifying admins, things like that. So data loss prevention is a way that your organization can prevent sensitive materials from leaving your organization. And they work in tandem with sensitive information types and sensitivity labels. So if I were to click within this document, we just see there's a passport number here, and I'm going to copy and paste this out, and I'm going to show this in action. So here we see the data loss policy has been applied. Whoops. And it's giving us that tooltip at the top. And the text here can be customized for your organization that, once a data loss policy has been activated, wherein a file has been shared based on certain conditions and contains certain types of sensitive information, you'll see that pop up on the document. And we'll also see that this document has had that sensitivity label applied, which says this contains personally identifiable information. So that's sensitivity and data loss policies kind of work hand in hand. Once sensitive information has been detected and certain actions have been applied to a file, such as sharing, a data loss prevention policy will be triggered. So I'm going to go back within the folder retention document library, and I'm going to create a new file and show a sensitivity label getting applied in real time. So I think we have some other documents. I think this one, employee data sheet. This one also shows that we have a passport number here, and it's triggered the sensitivity label to be applied. So I'm just going to create a new Word document. So this is a brand new Word document, totally clean. I'm going to close the other tab. I'm just going to say, I'm going to copy and paste my passport number, and I'm going to continue working in my document. I'm going to say, hello world, welcome to today's presentation. And within a couple seconds, what we should see here is that the sensitivity on the background, Purview is going to look for sensitive information. It's going to see it within this document, and then it's going to be tagged appropriately, saying that personally identifiable information has been detected within this document, and we would see that pop up at the top here. Just give that a second. I can try another passport number. Trigger it. Let's try another one. Passport number. Oops. Okay. There we go. Delete that. And there we go. So that just took a second to trigger, but here we see probably the first one also with the passport number. There is certain backend that's looking queries for numbers. So I'm just getting these from the internet. So some of them may or may not be real passport numbers, but here we see your organization has automatically applied the sensitivity label, personal identifiable information. So PII, very common in Canada as a sensitive information type. And here we see that because the passport numbers have been put in this document, we are getting this sensitivity triggered. Copy that. I'll navigate back to our document library. And here we see the document that I was just created, modified just a few seconds ago. And here we see that sensitivity label has been applied. And if I were to now share this with another user in my organization, so I'm going to hit share. I'm going to type Eddie1. There we go. I'm going to hit send. Now that I have shared a document with personally identifiable information, now, once again, within a couple seconds, I'm going to see that little triangle appear, and it's going to put a big kind of, red flag on this document saying like, hey, this document has personally identifiable information and it's been shared with someone. And then certain actions can be performed on that afterwards. While we're waiting for that to trigger on my document, something I'll also show is that within this employee data sheet, we were to go onto viewing mode. There we go. This is just another thing I want to show is that when I exit editing mode of a document that has a sensitive information type identified in it, as part of your configuration for your sensitivity labels, you can actually enable content marking. So here we have a content marking that says, warning, file contains PII. So once you exit editing mode and download the document, save it as a PDF, put it into viewing mode, whatever, you can actually enable content marking on those documents as well, just to once again reinforce users like, hey, sensitive information was identified. We applied a sensitivity label, and then you can kind of manipulate the data as see fit. So you can do content marking, you can put headers, footers, you can even encrypt the document as well. So there's a whole rich user experience within that. So this is just kind of a add-on to today's session, demonstrating sensitivity and data loss prevention. And then our core fundamentals was records management with retention labels and retention policies. And there I just refreshed. And here we see the document I created. It identified sensitive information, had a sensitivity label applied. I shared it, and now I get my data loss policy tooltip appearing, saying that it's been shared and certain actions must be taken now. So yeah, we're sitting at 3 minutes now. I open the floor to any questions. I know we had a bit of a fast pace, but I hope we got a lot of information out of this session. Okay.
Awesome. Thank you, Anthony. So if there's no new questions, while we wait for some questions on the chat, I'll just recap some of the questions that were asked here. Let's see, going to the top. I think the first question asked was, can we apply these labels to site pages? Yes, we can. And can we apply labels to folders and document sets? Yes, we can apply them to folders and document sets both, but the functionality is a little bit different. If you apply a label to a folder, it will inherit down the first time, but whenever you change the label on the folder itself, any sub items will not inherit those new changes of the labels downwards. Whereas document sets, if you change the label on the document sets, all the sub items do inherit that new label. Some other information. SharePoint site size limitation is 25 terabytes. Preservation hold library. So on the chat, I posted where you can actually access the preservation hold library, as well as if you wish to search the preservation hold library, which are items which will hold the items that were deleted, but still retaining for the full retention duration. Those will be available on the preservation hold library, and the URL is there. And it's also, you can use the eDiscovery solutions to search those locations. And we had an in-depth discussion about the disposition review process as well. For disposition review, if the out-of-the-box process might not be a good fit for a larger organization, where our automate the functionality that Anthony mentioned during the beginning of the presentation might be a good fit. And yes, the best practices to apply labels is automatic or defaulted classification. And are there any new questions here? If you select delete items automatically instead of review, do you get a list of log of everything deleted? Yes, you do. You can get it from the list of the deletion logs, kind of the same tab as where the disposition review is. And I think everybody is just saying thank you. All right.
I wanted to
yes.
mention, do you want to quickly show dispositions tab within Purview? At that.
We are at the 30-minute mark, so we can quickly show, but let me just conclude the webinar first, and then we can
Yep.
just quickly see the disposition review tab. Thank you, everybody, for joining today's session. I know it is 1:30 Mountain Time, which is the end of this webinar, but Anthony would like to quickly share the disposition review tabs with you guys if you want to take a look at that.
Yeah, sorry about that. I just forgot. There's a lot of content going on here, but if I navigate back to records management, I did have a tab open for disposition. So our disposition tab is organized by retention labels. Here we see all the different retention labels that have pending dispositions. I'm going to select the 1-day label. This is going to open up a new tab, and it's going to show me all the files that have had this retention label applied and then have a pending disposition. So as this loads quickly, we're going to see that there's some files here eligible for disposition. So there we go. I'm going to select one of them. I'm going to select the Seattle project. And here on the right-hand pane, we're actually going to get a quick preview of the file. So here we can actually see the contents of the file, its details, a history if other people have reviewed it. So you're able to review the file natively within Purview, and then to perform actions, you have approve disposal, relabel, extend, or add reviewers. I'm just going to approve disposal, provide a comment, hit apply, and then the document will be disposed of. And I'm not sure if this has 1 or 2 stages. It's probably gone on to the next stage, which is another user, but it's basically once an item's been deleted, it's going to appear here in your disposed items tab. So just a quick overview on that. But everyone, thank you so much for attending today's meeting, and I hope you have a great day.